Yeah, so welcome to our Climate Justice 101 guide launch. And yeah, before we get started, at any point, if you need to drop off, feel free to do that. This is just, sort of a community chat about it. So how did we get started doing this? So I think Richard sort of had a kickoff meeting in a learning group we had around climate justice. And it was just sort of a group of people that were, hey, we're interested in it. We want to do something about it. We wanted to be action oriented. And we were brainstorming like, well, what's something that could be useful to do? And I think one thing we were mindful of is we didn't want to, repeat great work that other people had already done. And for me personally, I was relatively new to it, but I was very interested. And I was just sort of reading random links on the internet. And I was hoping for just like a little bit more guidance. And, like click on a link and I wasn't really sure what I should click on or Google next. And it all just felt a little overwhelming. So we sort of decided, why don't we have a beginner-friendly guide that's not meant to be comprehensive. It's just meant to be sort of a starting point for people, and where we're not really, repeating other people's work, but we're really collecting and amplifying it, so that, if you're just stepping into it, like I was, there's sort of like a good place to begin. Um, and in the spirit of, keeping it action oriented, we didn't want it to just be about information or facts. We also wanted to structure in a way where, as you'll hear about soon from Alyssa, that you can use it to think about any topic in climate justice or beyond. So yeah, feel free to get started with that, Richard.
So I guess my assignment is to introduce the topic and also the first section of our guide, which is what is climate justice. So first of all, you should read the guide. It's going to do a better job of explaining it than my impromptu explanation here. But as we were looking at climate justice, and as I was like reading a ton of different information about it, I think we kind of crystallized that climate justice boils down to these two basic premises, which is that climate change's disproportionate impacts are unjust, and that justice requires that climate change solutions address those injustices. So to take the first, we understand that climate change won't affect everyone equally. It will hit marginalized people the hardest. It will hit the poorest the hardest. It will hit people of color the hardest. It will hit people who have contributed the least to climate change the hardest. And climate justice sort of starts with that recognition that the impacts of climate change will not be borne equally. And then looking further beyond that, we realize that the people who are suffering as a result of climate justice, the people who are suffering those disproportionate impacts, fall into two camps, the camps that are two very overlapping camps. One is people who have done very little to cause the problem. For instance, poorer nations have contributed very little to the carbon that's in the air, but richer nations poorer nations have contributed very little to the carbon that's in the air, but they'll actually suffer disproportionately the harms. And the same thing goes for poorer people in the world. And so that's sort of one group. And then another group is people who've been historically marginalized just in the sort of history of the world, history of our societies, often the same group, but it's a slightly different flavor on it. And so again, poor people, people of color, disabled people, indigenous people. I'm sure I'm leaving some out. So those are sort of the groups of people who will be affected most by the climate crisis, and in the view of climate justice, don't deserve to be affected disproportionately. So so start with that. That's a lot. And then I think one thing that we realized is that there's at least two major discourses going around climate justice that's sometimes overlap and often do overlap, but sometimes don't. And so it can be a little bit confusing. So for me, it was useful to really like hold that separation in mind, and to kind of develop that understanding as I read documents around climate justice. So we basically broke that down into an international discourse on climate justice, which is talking about a lot about like the extent to which richer nations owe poorer nations support and help as a result of the extent to which richer nations have contributed to climate change. And then the other discourse is sort of a domestic climate justice discourse, where we talk about within countries who is being affected most by climate change and how are those effects being amplified by historical marginalization, or how are they related to historical marginalization. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but that's a rough framework that we realized. And so like, yeah, at the international level, sort of the UN level, there's a lot of talk about like nation to nation. In the US, other Western countries, often the talk is about race or class or disability or indigenous rights or labor. So that's maybe a quick introduction.
Awesome. Thanks, Richard. And yeah, a little bit about how we structured our guide. So this is sort of a preview of the main topics we have. And like one thing I'll say is, you know, this is totally not comprehensive, and this is version 1. So there are actually a few things we wanted to bring in here. For example, talking about food and agriculture, talking about energy justice, that we just didn't get a chance to do because you know, a lot was going on in our lives outside of volunteering on this project. But for each of the sections, we do have, which were sort of, you know, voted on by the group. We structured it to first say, you know, what is it? Like, what do we mean when we talk about, you know, capitalism or indigenous sovereignty? And then we talk about, you know, why does this matter? And you know, I think that's sort of an important section of like, you know, besides, you know, very moral reasons to care about something, how is this also just impactful in relating to climate and to justice? And the next section I think is probably the most interesting structure that we have, which is what are the power dynamics? And I'll let Alyssa talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Yang. Yeah, so as mentioned, we wanted to create a framework that we could use to analyze the power dynamics across each topic, and to just, for folks who are reading it, to sort of internalize and understand these power dynamics and then start to see it, you know, everywhere in the world, not just about climate justice, but the idea being you could take these lenses, apply them to understand like really any problem that involves politics and power, and also look at like solutions and try to understand how they, you know, sort of perform or consider these different lenses. So the first one is distributive justice, which is looking at, you know, the burdens and benefits and how those are distributed. So who is harmed, who is helped. Just to give an example, there's unequal distribution of vulnerability to particular climate impacts along, you know, things like racial lines, such as heat waves. So for each topic, we looked at what some of the distributive justice challenges or considerations are for that topic. We also looked at procedural justice, which is about who has the power in decision-making and who is left out. So an example would be undocumented residents are often not involved in decision-making about adaptation infrastructure where they live. And the third one is recognition justice, which is about whose needs are seen or ignored in decision-making. So it's slightly different. It's less about who's in the room and more about how our processes, information, systems, acknowledging or ignoring the needs of different groups of people. Who are those people? How are their needs being seen or ignored? So for example, migrant workers and those in the informal sector are systemically made invisible through state policies. So maybe their perspectives and experiences are just like literally not represented when decisions are being made. And so these are three different lenses that I would say are not totally discrete. Like there's definitely overlap between them. And in many ways, you'll find that the dynamics are interlocking. So if you don't have procedural justice, then it's likely that you won't have recognition justice either. But it does help to sort of parse these challenges that sometimes are hard to make concrete in like specific ways. So we hope this framework is helpful. And it was interesting to analyze all of the different topics through this lens.
Awesome. yeah, and the last sort of two sections that we have for each of these topics is what's being done today, which is a lot of, you know, case studies, things like that. And then my personal favorite is, you know, what can I do next? And so we really try to, you know, bring in this very complex topic and bring it back to ourselves and what we can do. And yeah, from there, the last thing we'll do with the presentation side is just talk a little bit, just like a few minutes about each of the topics. So Alyssa?
Yeah. So the section that I covered was about climate debt, fair shares, and wealth. So Richard alluded to this a bit in the beginning, but the fact that our carbon resources and energy resources that have relied mostly on fossil fuels, like the use of that to power economies has not been evenly distributed. And it's mostly, you know, countries in the global north who have become wealthy over time and have powered their economies and sort of explosive growth. And then thus like created a lot more pollution, created a lot more carbon emissions historically. Historically, like the accumulated emissions, you know, the global north takes up way more atmospheric space than the global south. And then like today, currently, most global countries in the global north emit far more than the share of their population. So just some stats about that. The US emits more than 3 times its population share. India emits significantly less than its share. So India is responsible for 7% of carbon emissions, but they have 18% of the population. The United States has only 4.5% of the world population, but has in 104 years emitted more than South Africa, India, China, Brazil, and Indonesia. I think, you know, when we talk a lot about like climate justice on the domestic level, there is a lot of injustice, you know, here in the United States where most of the folks contributing to this guide are from, but really reading through all these stats blew my mind with respect to like how much we're missing of the international conversation when we aren't talking about this. Like, even though we have poor people in the United States who are experiencing climate change in an unjust way, even those people are more responsible for climate change than like the vast majority of people in the world. And the vast majority of people in the world live in the global south, which I think is like a really important thing to remember. So there's also like differences in historic responsibility, but there's also differences in capacity. So, you know, this section is also about high adaptive capacity, like in addition to becoming wealthy off of fossil fuels and like high consumption lifestyles, we also then in the global north have more capacity to adapt and to tackle these challenges. And so, you know, in terms of like what are the solutions offered, a lot of it comes down to climate reparations, paying back climate debt, doing a fair share of the work, which, you know, in richer nations really just looks like accelerating climate action as quickly as possible and trying to build that technology and the infrastructure as quickly as possible to be able to provide to countries that are still developing so that they can develop to their, you know, at the pace and full potential that they deserve to develop at. And I think the like practical case for this is really interesting, where it's like, if we need global coordinated effort, we need everyone to be on board, and to get everyone on board, there has to be like a base layer of fairness here. Otherwise we risk continuing to widen income inequality, and that will lead to further instability and insecurity, which if the whole point is to secure our worlds, like continuing to do this in such an uneven way doesn't make practical sense and won't get us to, you know, curbing planetary collapse. So yeah, I knew about this principle, but it was really interesting to dig deeper into it and sort of understand it more holistically. Yeah, I will pass it to Jocelyn.
So I, you know, in collaboration, worked on this section on capitalism and climate justice. And so capitalism, you know, certainly for those of us in the US and many of us around the world, is an economic system that we live with and deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so understanding how this interacts with climate justice, you know, in conjunction with social norms and, you know, the political environment, gives us a chance to better understand kind of where we fit in and what levers individuals and organizations can kind of pull to make a change in this area. So one of the most important ways that we focused on how capitalism relates to climate justice is capitalism's usual reliance on negative externalities. So those are the negative byproducts from the production of goods and services that aren't included in that price. So a common example of this is, when you drive a car, you're burning fuel that is releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's releasing toxins into communities, and the cost that those emissions release, have on the environment and the people in the community are not baked into the cost of gasoline or the cost of the car. A regulated market really can have more externalities be paid for, but it doesn't necessarily, and rarely ever are all negative externalities accounted for in the price of something. And so where we see climate justice really coming into play here is that these negative externalities don't affect everyone equally. So there are lots of examples. We'll get to the environmental racism section about how some communities are disproportionately affected by climate change and also environmental issues. And so we have this section on capitalism because we also can't ignore the role that private industry plays in polluting certain areas and often literally extracting resources from those areas to benefit people who usually do not live in those communities. And in many places, the profit generated from that extraction can also allow those businesses to increase their influence with regulators and allow themselves to help get even more leeway for their businesses to kind of work in those communities and cause harm there. There's a lot going on with climate justice and capitalism. Capitalism relies on growth, and this is, there are, when I was writing it, I felt like it was a little bit easy to get into a kind of doom and gloom spiral. But I would like to assure you that this does not. There are really examples of ways that organizations and individuals can work even within a capitalist system. There are, worker-directed co-ops. There are some companies that are really focusing on climate justice that are pretty exciting, and also some actions that we as individuals can do right away. So,
nice. Yeah, and I also just dropped in the chat just crazy stats about capitalism. 71% of global emissions come from 100 companies. Mostly fossil fuel, that also fueled a massive disinformation campaign around it. So it's pretty wild. Yeah, so I'll talk about the next two sections. I think a lot of times when people think about, disproportionate harms, they may not realize that it's not just happening when there's a climate crisis, like Hurricane Katrina, for example. It's also just happening on a daily basis already. And that's sort of what environmental racism is really pointing to. And, I think there's this one paper that came out from the National Academy of Sciences pretty recently, and, it had this just very stark graph of, in the US, if you are Latinx, you're most likely exposed to 63% more pollution than you produce. If you're Black, you're most likely exposed to 56% more pollution than you produce. But if you're a non-Hispanic white American, you're exposed to 17% less pollution than you would produce. And I think that was something that really stood out to me. And when we talk about, like Jocelyn mentioned, capitalism and racism and how these two things factor in, there's a lot of evidence now that class alone, income alone doesn't explain why certain communities of color are living in much more toxic environments, and that race is the biggest factor there. And, one example from that was, Black Americans who are making upwards of $50,000 a year are still way more likely to be living in a toxic environment compared with white Americans who are making just $10,000 a year. That was just, there are like a lot of things on that level. And also just on a personal note, when I was writing this, there was just like this memory that came up for me, which was, I remember visiting my grandma in China, and she's lived her whole life right next to a dump, like a sort of a toxic waste facility. And I just remember casually going outside for an afternoon, coming back in, washing my hands, and the water turned black. Like it didn't turn gray, it turned black. And I was like freaking out, and like no one else even blinked. They were like, yeah, like of course. And so that was just like, sort of like a personal moment for me where I realized like, people are being harmed every day, even in between, these climate disasters, which only make things worse. And, I think at the same time, it was like a very sort of hopeful thing I worked on, because I really got to see a lot of, environmental justice leaders doing really great work. We act as one of these communities. I think Richard's also involved with them. And it was, very inspiring to just learn about all of that. And next section, I think similarly, if we're going to talk about capitalism and racism, how can we not talk about colonialism? And so that's a really big part of, Indigenous rights and land sovereignty. And there's this quote here from, a leading member of a tribe native to Chad, who says, the world needs to understand that Indigenous people are only 5% of the world's population, but protect 80% of the world's population. And this was really a section where, when I was doing research on it, there's some crazy, crazy evidence at this point of things that, Indigenous people have known essentially their whole lives and their whole generations, which is that, the systems of colonialism that we've had have just been very extractive. They've been, extracting people, they've been extracting the environment. And basically the most well-protected environments in the world are like protected by Indigenous people. And at the same time, 90% of Indigenous land is not legally recognized or protected today. And there's estimates that, if we do respect Indigenous land sovereignty, and we respect Indigenous rights, and we protect Indigenous people and their land, not only is that a giant, human rights crisis, but it could also reduce carbon dioxide by an estimated 10 gigatons by 2050, and 37% of cost-effective CO2 mitigation by 2030. So just crazy impacts that I think the world is now realizing about, the importance of Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous practice. And yeah, last but not least, Richard.
Thanks. So I did the labor and a just transition section with a lot of help from other people in this team. So this is a really interesting area of climate justice. It's actually really, really written about. It's a lot of people doing a lot of thinking about this. And in some ways, I think some people think of just transition as really equivalent to climate justice, or yeah, basically the same thing, or while other people think of it as something quite narrow. So I'll give you the narrow definition first, and then kind of like expand it out to the bigger definition. So the very simplest definition of just transition is that we're on the verge of this massive transition in our lives, in our world, from remaking our entire economy and our society from one that's based on fossil fuels to one that's based on renewable energies, or at least is low carbon, or is something different from what we're doing. And in that massive remaking, there's going to be societal disruptions. And the idea between just transition is that workers will be harmed by this transition, particularly workers in the fossil fuel economies. And so we need to provide for them a just transition, a transition that allows that transition from relative whatever relative security or income that they have to one that's equivalent. So this is most often talked about in the context of like fossil fuel workers. It's most often talked about in terms of coal miners. So a lot of the discussion at the international level is like, what do we do for coal communities? Because everyone's talking about coal as kind of the first fossil fuel that needs to be phased out because it's the dirtiest and it's the most contributing to carbon emissions. So that's kind of where the conversation starts. But I think the conversation around just transition has really broadened out from that, particularly among activist groups, but also among think tanks, international NGOs. A lot of people are talking about what are the just transitions we need to make everywhere for every part of society. And so I think for a number of people, just transition is really about not just how do we transition fossil fuel workers, or not only how do we transition workers, but how do we transition every aspect of society. And in that transitioning, how can we reimagine society? How can we really use this transition to address all of the historic injustices, all the historic inequities that exist within our society and our world? So just transition, on the one hand, is sometimes a very narrow thing, like how do we make sure that the coal miners are cared for? And the other hand, it's this enormous thing where it's like, how do we create a better world out of this opportunity of transition? And I think, actually this version of the guide, the version that I ended up finishing sometime yesterday or the day before, this version of this part of the guide, I think maybe doesn't address that part as much. And so I might revise in the next few days. But there's a visionary aspect to just transition that's really exciting and inspiring. And as a result, there can be a little bit of confusion between like, what is the difference between just transition and what is the difference between climate justice? And I think, for some people, even the label just transition maybe is a bit more explanatory, than a little bit more self-evident than climate justice, because it implies like what the actual action is. The action is, as we transition, we need to make it just. So anyway, that's a little bit of an introduction to that concept.
Awesome. Yeah, and I also just want to say thank you to everyone who's choosing to spend time with us on a random Wednesday in the middle of the day to hear about reimagining society as we save the planet. No big deal. And also just wanted to say thanks to everyone, like all my teammates here that spent a lot of hours trying to make something that was beginner friendly, but also has a lot of information for us. So this next part is totally optional. Feel free to jump off if you need to leave, or if you're burned out. But if you want to just like engage a little bit with us, because we'd love to chat with you all and not just talk. We're thinking to do these optional breakout rooms. There's not too many of us, I think, so we'll probably just do like a couple people in each, very intimate. And we just want to sort of chat a little bit with y'all about either or both of these questions. So the first one is, what's a personal exposure, connection, or interest you have when it comes to climate change or climate justice? And the second one, a bit more, action-oriented, is what's something you want to do or explore next when it comes to climate justice? And it's totally okay if you don't have answers for these things. We can just sort of share and reflect together and chat. So yeah, Richard, you want to put people in breakout rooms?
I'm actually having problems with the breakout rooms. Hold on, let me just pause the recording while we do.
Alrighty, well.
Okay, you're recording again.
Awesome. So I just want to say thank you guys so much for spending your evening or afternoon with us. Thank you so much to Yang and to Richard for facilitating this process through the last, God knows how long, 6 months, I guess. Thank you to everyone else who has participated in making this happen. And if you are in this call at the moment and are not a part of the Work on Climate community and want to be, drop something in the chat and we can make sure you get added. I think that we have your contact information already from this sign up. So if you're interested in kind of hearing more about this in general, feel free to drop something in the chat as well. And we'll try to keep y'all in the loop. No promises about any like, you know, kind of like immediate products or anything, but
we have a form for mailing list, right?
Yes, we do. I don't have the
Oh,
link.
someone just dropped it in. Okay, great.
Awesome. Cool. And without any further ado, yes, thank you guys so much and have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Yeah,
So-
thank you all.
Thanks. Enjoy the guide. Tell us what you think.
Yes. Read the guide, that as well.